Before we start today's podcast, I want to ask you a question. What if you could change a life? Key for Life is a charity whose mission is to break the cycle of crime by reducing youth reoffending. Its award-winning 7-step rehabilitation program used both in and out of prisons has been independently evaluated and recognized by the Ministry of Justice Data Lab as one of the most effective models for creating change in this area. Only 14% of participants on the Key for Life program have reoffended 1 year post-release, compared to the national rate of 64%. Key for Life was founded and is run by Eva Hamilton, one of the most extraordinary women I know, who was also my first guest on Bandwidth Conversations. I'm a trustee for the charity and am privileged to mentor a wonderful and talented young man. There are many ways people can help: volunteering, mentoring, providing a work taster, or donating. For more information, please look at www.keyforlife.org.uk, all lowercase. Help change a life. Thank you. Hello and welcome to Bandwidth Conversations, a podcast that finds out about the stories and journeys of artists, performers, and rock stars of life. I am Katie Brewer, and my guest today is a screenwriter, director, and author. He has directed both films and TV series. He wrote and directed Jack and Sarah with Richard E. Grant, Judi Dench, and Ian McKellan. He directed, among others, The Casebook of Sherlock Holmes, Thatcher The Final Days, the last 90-minute episode of Cold Feet, and Coronation Street. His scripts include Letters to Juliet with Amanda Seyfried and Vanessa Redgrave. He co-wrote A Handful of Dust, Where Angels Fear to Tread, and more recently My Little Pony, A New Generation, which shot to the #1 movie slot worldwide on Netflix in its first week of release. He is now the author of a series of crime novels which are gripping, clever, twisty, yet also touching and funny, featuring a brilliant but socially awkward detective, D.I. George Cross, set in and around Bristol. What is less known about him is that he was part of a stand-up comedy duo called Sullivan and More, and that he started his career as a chauffeur for the actor Anthony Andrews on Brideshead Revisited. I am super excited to be talking today to Tim Sullivan. Tim, thanks so much for being here.
Such a pleasure.
Well, at the time of this podcast, which is the 4th of June, 2024, you are about to launch the paperback of your new D.I. George Cross series. It's called The Teacher, and we're going to come back to that later. But I'd like to jump back to Clifton College, a boarding school in Bristol where you grew up. My husband went there too, and it's thanks to Jeremy Pickles that we're having this conversation today. And in particular, I'd like to go to your final year at Clifton, where two things happened. You were awarded an exhibition to Cambridge to read law, and you were expelled.
Correct.
Which were you most proud of?
I think it's a combination of both. I actually got an exhibition to read English. My father made me change to law.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which was part of an ongoing problem. Looking back on it, there was no way I should have been expelled, but I was, and I hold on to it as a badge of honor. And in fact, years later, I was at Granada doing the Casebook of Sherlock Holmes with another old Cliftonian called John Madden, who went on to direct Shakespeare in Love. And we were with our cameraman in a lift. He said, "So you guys both went to the same school?" John went, yeah. This cameraman said, "David Odd, how did it go for you? What happened to you, John?" And John went, "I was head boy." And I went, "Oh, right." And he said, "Tim, what about you?" And I was expelled. And David said, "Oh, that makes complete sense, knowing both of you." It was something my father never, ever accepted. And I used to say to him, we had terrible rows about it. And I used to say to him, "Don't you understand how cool it is to be expelled and in the same term get an exhibition to Cambridge?"
Yes.
And he couldn't. But, I was thrown out of my boarding house. I had the study that had the fire escape. Because I was doing the extra term, I was doing it very seriously because there was no point in going back unless you're going to work as hard as you could.
Yeah.
So I'd often be up till 2 or 3 in the morning, and I just let the boys in and out going to the pubs and whatever. In the end, I was deemed to be a bad influence, and I got thrown out of the boarding house, and a very sweet man called Mr. Goodland and his wife, who my history teachers, took me in their house up the road. And then I had an altercation with the marshal, which led to my expulsion. I claim I just bumped into him, but he did end up on his arse in the cricket nets. And I told this story at the webcast that I did at Clifton with Brian Worthington, my old English teacher. And the current headmaster was there, and he thought this was the funniest thing he'd
It's
ever
brilliant.
heard.
It's absolutely brilliant.
But yeah, Dad never, till the day he died quite early, could never accept it. And, you know, he was obsessed. He was a good academic himself, been in the RAF for a long time as an education officer. But his main regret in life was that he hadn't been a lawyer. So he tried to foist that off on me. And, you know, we had terrible battles. I mean, he took away in those days, we all had grants. And he took away my grant. But the irony was that I had to do an extra year at Cambridge. And in that fourth year, I was asked to show on my 21st birthday. A friend of mine said, he was a mature student, I've got two friends coming up from London. They want to make a movie in Cambridge. Can you show them around? So I was showing these two guys around, and they were David Putnam and Hugh Hudson. And the movie was Chariots of Fire. And I ended up casting all the Cambridge extras. And through that, a wonderful legendary production manager called Joyce Hurley got me the job with Anthony Andrews, which then led to... So in the end, my father's interference actually led me on a path that was terrific.
Yes. And did he ever, given that you've had such a successful career, did he ever turn around and say, oh, you were right not to go into law?
No, he refused to watch anything on television that I directed.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, he kind of had... There was some sort of weird Victorian thing going on with my father. But yeah, he never watched any of it. But he died in 1989. So I'd only really just started. I directed Coronation Street in 88. A Handful of Dust hadn't been made yet. So he didn't really live to see the success.
Right. And there's another very famous old Cliftonian, Simon Russell Beale, who equally, his father was dead set against him being an actor. And I think Brian Worthington had to speak to his father to say, you really do need to allow him to do that.
I've met Simon a few times through Brian. A friend of mine, sadly now, a late friend, Roger Michel, also an ex-Cliftonian. We couldn't go to Brian's 70th birthday celebrations in Bristol, so we gave him a lunch in London, and Simon was there. But yeah, I didn't know that about him. You know, Brian was responsible for a whole clutch of kind of successful English students.
How do you think Cambridge equipped you for your life ahead?
It was different in those days. You have to work a lot harder these days to get your degree. But yeah, no, it did. I mean, two things really. I mean, I directed quite a lot of drama, acted very badly in some drama. It became very clear to me very early on that I couldn't act. And because there's no drama course at Cambridge, you have to set it all up yourselves. The students set it up. They run the ADC, they run footlights. And so that gave you a kind of understanding of what was possible. I also made my first short film there. And in those days, and it was funded by something called the Judith E. Wilson Fund. In those days, you couldn't just shoot something on your phone. I mean,
yes,
that was Star Trek. In fact, that was even further than Star Trek. They just had... So, you know, I had to raise the money and have a film crew, and I made a short film about a deaf mute girl. So, yeah, it kind of set me up with a sense of independence and definitely a determination of what I wanted to do. I mean, weirdly, I really enjoyed my law course.
Oh, did you?
I thought some of the teaching was fantastic. Some of the lectures, ex-barristers were just so bright and smart. And, you know, when I went on to work at Granada, I actually challenged their staff contract because they tried to say that they already owned a comedy that I came up with. When I went into their contract, I found the word existing programs. And so with my legal hat on, because it was still quite recent, you know, I'd only done my law degree 2 years before. Now I've forgotten it all, of course. But yes, it's a time I remember very, very fondly. Great people around me. So yeah, it was terrific.
And you certainly hit the ground running, because one of the arguments that your father could have had, or that people have, I have two singer-songwriter daughters, and the problem with going into these creative industries is it's so oversubscribed, so competitive, so hard to make any headway in. But I think I'm right in saying for you that within weeks of leaving Cambridge, you had been commissioned to write a script. And then within months, you were working at Granada and writing scripts for them as well. Was that good luck or hustling?
The first script with Derek Jarman was definitely a hustle. And Derek was a wonderful, wonderful man. One of those people who's a great encourager of young talent, both people who were fundamental in my early career were both called Derek and were both gay and were both fantastically encouraging of young talent, male or female. You know, Tilda Swinton became one of Derek's muses, and Sandy Powell, the famous costume designer, now she got her first job with Derek. He was an extraordinary, extraordinary man. So yeah, I found myself working on a couple of scripts with him, and then we got a commission to write a silent medieval horror movie. And then when Derek went on to rewrite it, he rewrote it in verse, but it never got made. It was called Bob Up or Down. But it was a wonderful, you know, I still have the scripts in those days, you know, well, I still write longhand, actually. I write everything longhand, but I still have those scripts. And Derek's comments, they're more vicious than anything I got at Clifton. Sort of red lines through all of going, what the fuck is this? You know, it's like, but that was a real
brutal.
Yeah, and it was brutal, but, you know, good for him, you know, and it really, sadly, he died during the filming of my first movie. And what I always say about Derek, people ask me, you know, would Derek have liked Jack and Sarah? And I go, absolutely not. But he would love the fact that I made it.
So I'd love to talk about your work kind of in three, we can call them episodes or acts, whatever, given it's creative. The first one is your script writing. And my dear friend and super talented author, Natasha Mostert, says that script writing is particularly difficult because it's competitive, and that even if you have a pilot that's successful, then the other writers will be brought in and then it's kind of torn apart, rewritten. Has that been your experience?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that it's really weird because the script is fundamentally the most important thing because it's where everything starts from. But in certain situations as a scriptwriter, you can find yourself treated without the, I would say, necessary respect. But it depends who you're working with. And the most successful producers and production companies are the ones that treat all their talent with respect. And I mean, when you work in animation, you have to, as a scriptwriter, you have to put your ego away. Animated films, like I worked on Shrek 4, although my script wasn't used. I worked on Flushed Away and My Little Pony. And it's essentially a committee process that you've got to have a really thick skin for.
Isn't that very difficult? Because someone has to lead, I would have thought, with a storyline.
Yes. I mean, with animation, it's very much a collaborative process. You've got so many people involved. It's such a complex and fascinating process that it's the most collaborative movie process there is. So the boundaries get blurred, but you have to be able to cope with that. And you have to understand that the script is an ever-shifting thing. When I worked on Flushed Away, I didn't realize that someone like Jeffrey Katzenberg, who's, you know, big movie mogul, would be so hands-on. But I learned an awful lot. I mean, when I came to do Shrek 4, we did a script, which they then decided was the wrong idea. So they flew me out to LA and they wanted to work on a new idea, which I thought was great, which was that Shrek goes in search of his father when he becomes a father. And I had quintuplets who were merchandising Dream.
Yes.
And I basically, over a period of 3 weeks, had to pitch the movie every other morning, sometimes at 6 o'clock in the morning, to Jeffrey and the two other heads of DreamWorks Animation every other day. So you really get your ducks in order. And the sad thing about that was that a few months later, they brought in a director who had he wanted to remake It's a Wonderful Life, which I thought was a terrible idea. I was told a lovely story that a couple of years later, I never saw Shrek Goes Forth because it was too painful.
Painful.
And had nothing to do with my script. But Jeffrey had been given, I don't know why. I mean, I don't think Shrek Goes Forth did as well as possibly they hoped. But someone made a little A5 copy of my script and framed it in a glass frame and then had etched on the frame, in case of emergency, please break, with a little hammer.
Oh,
and he had it behind his desk. So in a sense, that's almost as good as having the movie made.
That's really tough to work so hard on something and for it then to disappear. And how do you rebound from that?
Well, it's difficult. I mean, I thought it was kind of devastating, but I had dinner a couple of years ago with the playwright Laura Wade and Jack Thorne, who's the kind of leading screenwriter in the country at the moment. And she had just been fired off a American project. And Jack said, you're not a grown-up screenwriter until you've been fired from a Hollywood production. And I went, I've been fired too. And it just sort of made everything much better, you know. He'd been fired from a Star Wars. I'd been fired from Shrek. I can't remember what Laura had been. But it made it much better to kind of, it's part of the process.
Letters to Juliet. I want just to touch on that because it is so delightful, gentle, heartwarming, hopeful. I rewatched it the other day and I think I told you in an email that my daughters, I think, know the script off by heart. What inspired you to do that?
That was a rewrite job. It was written by the screenwriter of Motorcycle Diaries, and it hadn't worked. I was brought in to do a page one rewrite, which I did, and it got it into production. But it's a kind of mixed story for me. I think it's a lovely movie, but the director, who was sadly had a brain tumor and died not long after, which was terribly sad. Very nice man. He said to me one day, we met in London, he said, I just really want to thank you for getting this movie into production with your script. It's just so brilliant. I went, oh, great. He said, I've got really good news. And I said, what's that? He said, the studio are allowing me to bring my best friend from film school in America over to do on-set rewrites. And I looked at him and I said, how's this good news for me, the writer? And I think the movie works. I'm really glad people love it. But that man came in and caused devastation, I thought. And, there are some lines in it, and I'll put this out there. I've never spoken about this before. I remember Variety or Hollywood Reporter giving it a not great review and saying, Tim Sullivan will have lines like, I had no idea true love had an expiration date hanging around his neck for the rest of his career. I didn't write that bloody line,
That's so galling.
So that was a mixed, because it did really well, but it was, to my mind, half the movie it should have been with my script, unaltered.
And as a scriptwriter, I guess, then as soon as you hand it over, you don't have any... I wondered how involved you'd been in the filming.
Not at all. And I went over to see... I hadn't met the producers. I'd done all this work across the Atlantic. And I was invited over to go and see the premiere. So I thought, okay, I'll go. And we were in the Chinese theatre, on Hollywood. When I arrived, I was walking down the red carpet. There were all these photographers taking photographs. And I came along. I heard one of these photographers say, who's this guy? And he went, oh, don't worry, it's just a writer.
Wow.
There's Hollywood for you, baby. Anyway, I watched the movie and, some of it, I'll be honest with you, led to me having my head in my hands. And I was with my agent and a great friend. And as I walked out, I was introduced to the producers. So, of course, I did the usual thing of saying, oh, well done, so lovely. Great film, God, I thought you did such a great job. To which one of them replied, Tim, we were sitting behind you. How much of the movie exactly did you see with your head in your hands? But I thought it was a shame. But listen, it did $100 million and I thought it could have done 3.
Yeah.
But, it is what it is. And those are the experiences where you just move on. That's Hollywood,
Yes.
But I'm really glad that your daughters love it.
They do love it. And we don't have the compare and contrast. So we don't know what the alternative was. So My Little Pony, A New Generation, that was a phenomenal success. I read the plot. It's quite complicated. It's got some really adult themes in there, prejudice, people pulling the wool over, or leaders pulling the wool over other people's eyes for their own benefit. So for those who would like to try, what are the key abilities? One is resilience by the sound of things that you need to have to be a successful scriptwriter.
Gosh, I don't know really. Just to go back to My Little Pony, a very different experience, a very fantastic experience, lovely people, very collaborative, all working in the same direction. We were amazed we got those themes through because I always thought Hasbro, who's a toy company, were kind of, it was a movie for them. And, we wanted to write about prejudice. We wanted to write about propaganda. We wanted to write about certain leaders in America. Pulling wool over your eyes is one way of putting it. There's a less polite way of putting it.
Yeah.
So, that was a fantastic experience. I think to be a scriptwriter, it's tough. It's very tough to get a project away. I've got a stack of unproduced movie scripts, which I think are really good. But it's about time and place and luck and so many things. Of course, you think your script's the best in the world, but there are loads of factors. If you haven't got an actor, forget it. If you haven't got a proper big actor. And it's fine to make short movies. I mean, my advice to anyone now, if you want to be a script writer, write some short films and film them with your friends on your phone. But have a really good hook, have a really good story, in a 10-minute film. And you'll get noticed. Put it up on YouTube. Things that we didn't have an opportunity to do. If you want to write. Write every day. Even if you're not writing something, write every day. And also, if you've got an idea for a screenplay, don't go, all right, I'm going to sit down tomorrow and write it all, because it's daunting. Write bits you like. Write the scenes that you already have in your head that you think are great. Doesn't matter where they are in the movie. Just write them down.
That's great advice. Okay, let's move on to Act 2, which is your directing. And you were only 26 when you were put on a very prestigious director's training scheme. Directing is a totally different skill to script writing. And you weren't just directing anyone. You were directing some of our all-time greatest actors. So that's Judi Dench, Ian McKellan, Richard E. Grant, James Nesbitt. I would imagine that's quite daunting at best. Were you nervous?
I remember on Jack and Sarah, Eileen Atkins, Judi Dench, and Ian McKellan all had their first scene on the movie together. And I was absolutely bricking it. But they're just such delightful people who are so professional. The difficult ones are the frightened ones. The difficult ones are the insecure actors, of which there are a few. You have to work out what it is they're frightened of and show them that you're a pair of safe hands, in a sense. I mean, it was always my dream to direct, and writing because I was a writer-director, my kind of writing career in the States took off in a way with my directing career. But if you get offered a movie to direct, and I was offered a few, with me, always needed a rewrite. So that was a year and a half, and you were paid well, and then you couldn't cast it for whatever reason. And then the movie died. So then another one would come along. And after 3 of these, you haven't made a movie for 6 years. And then Ron Howard came along and commissioned me to write a script, which you can't resist. You can't resist working with a director of that caliber. So I love directing. And in a funny sort of way, it is a similar skill because you're telling a story. It's just the director is the only person on a film set or a TV set that has all the interests almost equally of the project in his or her mind. The composer wants the music a bit louder or wants more music. The scriptwriter's concerned about certain lines that have been changed. The actor's concerned about their role, or, the producer's concerned about money.
Yeah.
The director's the only one that's just working in the midst of all of that, holding it together. And I think it's increasingly become an undervalued role.
Jack and Sarah, you wrote and directed it, and I actually hadn't heard of anyone else doing that, apart from a former guest on the show, Sir Christopher Hampton, who did it with Carrington. And so is that actually quite commonplace? It
is much more so now than it was. In those days, you were either a writer or a director, but now you've got people like Alex Garland, English people, Paul Greengrass. So, yeah, there are a lot more writer-directors than there were. In the old days, there used to just be sort of Woody Allen and various other people. But the thing about film or TV is telling a good story.
Yeah.
And that comes down to script and direction.
Well, let's move on to telling a good story in another way. And I'd love to move on to your novels that you've written. I think I'm right in saying that COVID happened and you decided to write a crime novel, and it's now turned into a series. So far, 6 books in the series. So I have 3 questions, which was why a novel, why a crime novel, and why a detective on the autistic spectrum?
I'd always had the ambition to write a novel. I didn't know whether I could. So I wanted to see whether I could, because it's a very different skill to writing a screenplay. A screenplay sort of has so many functions. At one point, it's a selling document trying to get people to invest. At another point, it's a casting document trying to persuade an actor to be involved. And then in the end, it becomes an instruction manual as to how you want your movie made, to give us best direction as a writer that you can. With a novel, it felt a bit more scary because it was something I hadn't done. I was in my 60s. And, I thought, oh my God, can I write prose? And when COVID came along, My Little Pony had finished. There was no production, obviously. And it was kind of, okay, do I sit down now and write another script that I add to my pile of scripts that I'm trying to... No, I'll try and write a novel. Why not use the time? I felt at home with crime because, I'd done Sherlock with Jeremy Brett, and I'd set up, although it got made in a different form, a series of Maigret at Granada.
Oh, yes.
Which I didn't end up involved in. Creative differences with the producer, which ended up starring Michael Gambon. So I had a kind of good grounding in crime. And crime, I felt I knew possibly how to do it. And autism, particularly the end of the spectrum where it's not nonverbal. It used to be called Asperger's, but we can't call it Asperger's anymore because of Hans Asperger's links with the Nazis. So it's called Autism Spectrum Condition now. It had fascinated me for years, particularly in the workplace, particularly people's attitudes to it and the way they dealt with it. So I'd done quite a lot of research. I did a couple of years researching into it just because sometimes I do that. So I decided to put the two together. I came up with this character, George Cross, although we mustn't say socially awkward anymore because what the autistic community don't like that. What we really are saying is that they're perceived by neurotypical people as socially awkward.
Right.
Which I understand now. I get that.
Yes, me too.
And with George, what's been interesting with the books, which are doing well now, the readers are really, it's all about George. They all love George because he's a very endearing character. He's quite literal. Not all people with autism are unempathetic, but he's not got great empathy. So he's had to learn how to read people's emotions and their body language. Unlike many people with a second language, which in a sense this is for him, he's become really good at it. And essentially, because of his adherence to the evidence and the logic and patterns and the breaking of patterns, he's extremely successful. So his condition is his gift, is what makes him so successful.
Yes. And I remember reading years ago now, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night Time by Mark Haddon, and which was brilliant. And I think, we were all amazed how he had managed to get inside Christopher's head. And you have done exactly the same with George. And so he is a lovable character.
One rule I have is that we don't laugh at George. We laugh with him. And if anyone is critical of him, the audience tend to take George's side.
Oh, totally.
Yeah, I think that at the beginning I was rejected by various literary agents because I'm not autistic and because my children aren't autistic. And I was told that it was neuroscientific appropriation. So I said to my wife, look...
But then that means people only ever write biographies.
Absolutely right. And not many people are going to want to read, books about 60-odd-year-old white men in Islington writing books. So they're just not going to read them. So I said to my wife, right, sod this, I'm going to self-publish. And, I've done a lot of work into autism. I've gone to see various experts up at Cambridge and a guy from Tony Atwood from Australia.
Did you have any sort of medical professional review it afterwards?
No, I decided to get it out into the world and see what the autistic community said.
Okay.
And my deal was, if there's the publishers basically said there would be pushback. But George and the writing in the books have been hugely embraced by the autistic community. I think I've had 2 negative emails. One that said, my nephew's autistic and he's not like that. Fair enough.
Okay.
And one that said, only autistic people should write autistic characters. Don't agree with that. But, I had an email about 6 months ago from a woman saying, really great to see an autistic character portrayed in such a positive light. By the way, I'm a autistic serving police officer in the UK police force.
Oh,
so you
my
thought,
goodness.
okay, that's been really, relative to people with autism. I've had some corrections from people with autism about expressions and things, which I take on board. But it's been very, very warmly embraced, which has been very rewarding and unexpected for me.
I guess there are 2 things. You want a book to go out and for it to entertain, but when you know that it's actually helped people as well, because they've been able to identify with it or treat someone differently because they can see that in someone else, that must be just hugely, hugely rewarding.
Unexpected and very rewarding.
Well, you started self-publishing and then you were then taken on by the head of Zeus, which is part of Bloomsbury Publishing. I looked at self-publishing and I was told, no, you can't self-publish because then no one's going to know it's there and no one's going to read it. So how did you manage to sort of get over that first hurdle?
I mean, I did an online course about self-publishing. I mean, you've got to really look into it. You've got to invest. I mean, you've got to advertise. And basically, I think when you're starting, the best place is Facebook. You've got to have a really good cover design. You can't have an amateurish looking cover design. You've got to have a good book. And you've got to have that book copy edited and proofread properly. Because the one thing in self-publishing where you will just get knocked back is constant grammatical or syntactical or whatever mistakes. People really don't like that. But yeah, it's a question of making that book visible. And you do it by various means. You know, you advertise coming up to the date. You've got to have a website. You try and create interest. As someone said, it's all about visibility. And, you know, one of the things I learned is that you need to have a second book.
Right.
So you want to have two books. And in the back of the first book, you have a link to the second book. So I published the first one and you make it free for a while, but that's quite dangerous because free often equals crap in people's minds. But, you know, I published the first book in July of 2020. Cyclist, the second book, came out 10 weeks later. And I was amazed that by the day it was released, I had 1,000 pre-orders for the Cyclist.
Wow. Pre-orders.
Yeah. And then we realized that the Dentist being free was going bonkers. And that doesn't normally happen. And it's free advertising for the Cyclist. So by November, so 4 months after I'd published, I'd had over 200,000 downloads.
Wow.
And then my wife and I went, so we knew nothing about publishing. Should we get some PR for this? Because that seems like quite a lot. I went to a PR company and they read and they went, oh my God, why aren't you properly published? And I went, I'm doing very well, thank you very much. And they said, oh, well, our CEO has just started a literary agency. Can we send it to him? So he read it and went, I want to represent you. I don't really need you to, because now I was making money, you know, because self-publishing, if you get it right, you know, you publish a book on Amazon at $3.99. You as a self-published author get £3.40 from that.
Okay.
So if you get it right, you can make money.
Yes.
But the rule of self-publishing is, of that £3.40, you put 50% of it into advertising the next day.
Right.
So you're always putting half your money back into advertising. You don't see it as income. You see it as a resource to use. So then I thought, well, got picked up by a publisher and it's going really well.
Well, I read The Dentist, which was your first George Cross novel. And from the first paragraph, I knew two things, which was that I was going to love the story and I was going to love George. And in fact, it was the first couple of sentences. I liked them so much, I'm going to read them. The young woman standing in front of him was smiling. Cross was sure of this as her mouth was turned up at both corners, which was a definite sign. He wasn't sure what it meant, though, because he didn't know her. With people he knew, he would note the upturned mouth, together with what had been said, combine it with the tone in which it had been said, and make his inference. Context was everything for Cross. And I knew in those 2 or 3 sentences, that's it, I'm going to absolutely adore it. So I kind of can't believe that was your first novel. You write in a very straightforward way. It's not cluttered by alliteration. It's snappy, it's pacey. You know who's talking without you even having to assign, you know, Mackenzie or Otti, who I also love. Carson. I know a lot of Carsons.
Yeah, we all do.
Yeah, I was just swept along with it. And the plot is complicated. Did you know exactly what was going to happen in the plot before you wrote your first word? Or what is the order of things in which you did it?
All I know is who has died. That's it.
That's it?
Yeah.
Did you know who'd killed them?
No.
Oh my goodness. Because I imagine, because it's like a jigsaw puzzle, feels like a jigsaw puzzle, that you would have knew the puzzle and then you'd write around it. But that's amazing that you just, okay, please. So how do you go about it?
Well, as I say, I know who my victim is, but that's it. And what that means is it's quite frightening because you're never sure whether you've got a book or not. But it also means that you and George are discovering things at the same time as the reader. The reader can never get ahead of you. Although some people have said, you know, I knew who did it on page 200. And I go, well done, because I didn't. And that's fine. As long as you finish the book, I don't care. But if you know what the ending is, if you know who the killer is, you're kind of then spending most of that book trying to distract the reader.
Yes.
To get them going the wrong way. With me, I literally get to a point where Cross doesn't know where to go next because I don't know where to go next. And I find that both challenging and terrifying. But it works for me. I think someone said that writers are divided into two types. Crime writers, planners and pantsers. And there are the ones that plan, the ones that fly by the seat of their pants. I'm definitely the latter.
And I have a former guest and friend, Santa Montefiore, and her advice to aspiring writers was to get it down on paper and then get it right. So as you're writing, are you editing as you go along? Yeah, how do you do that aspect of it?
I write longhand in fountain pen. I can't write and type. It doesn't work for me. So I write longhand in big notebooks. And then obviously that's got to be put into the computer, which I do. And as you put it into the computer, you're kind of editing as you go along. I've just finished the 7th book a couple of weeks ago, and the publishers have it. And they'll come back to me next week or the week after. And I love that process where you've got it. I get great notes from them, where things aren't working or things are giving away too quickly. But also it's where you can go in and make it right, like she says. And that's brilliant to have that ability to go in and make it right, to make it better. Never sit down and think, oh, that's great, I've done that. There's always an opportunity to make it better. And you have to grasp those opportunities.
Yeah. And you're writing really quickly because that's your 7th book then in 4 years.
Yeah. I'm of a certain age. I thought I better get on with this. I need to be noticed, and that also sort of to an extent comes from the screenwriting. I write to deadline. I mean, I've met some crime authors who are really horrified when I meet them on a Saturday and they go, oh, what are you doing? Oh, well, I'm delivering a book on Monday. Oh, right. So how's it, what are you doing? Well, I'm still writing it. And they go, you're what? And I'm writing it till 10 o'clock that morning, And as I've got more trust with my publishers, I'm more confident of it not being fully formed when it goes in, so that you can be braver, I think. But there has to be a trust to do that.
Yes. Well, I've just read the latest one that's coming out in the series, The Teacher, and I felt very privileged given the fact that it hasn't come out as a paperback yet, although at the time we release this podcast, it will be out that week.
On bloody election day.
On election day. But that's right. Well, then, if it's a depressing
Don't
day.
Don't vote, read my book.
Exactly. Yeah. A lot more rewarding reading your book. Yeah. So I absolutely adored it. And I felt like I was on a roller coaster. And in terms of twists and turns, you surpassed even yourself. And there were so many intertwining threads. Carson surprised on the upside.
Yeah.
At the end of the book, in the acknowledgements, and you touched on it in the Clifton College interview that you did, you said, I feel it incumbent upon me to make it clear that the experiences I've drawn on this novel are based on my time at my first prep school and not at Clifton College, where things were quite different and I was happy. I still find it unbelievable and inexcusable what happened to me and my contemporaries in a quiet corner of Somerset many years ago. The writing of this novel has been surprisingly cathartic. So, Tim, what happened? Are you okay to talk about it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I just won't name the school because it's still functioning and I don't think it's fair. It was run by an alcoholic. It was run by an alcoholic sadist. And there was no sexual abuse that I knew of, but the physical abuse was extraordinary. He just beat us all the time.
And you were how old? You were 7? 9 to 13.
I ran away 4 times. So my parents eventually took me out at 11. Yeah, he was just it was a terrible, I can feel the fear in my stomach now when I think about it. And because it was so terrible, your parents didn't believe you, which kind of led to a very difficult, that impacted me in life, the notion of frustration, not being believed. I get frustrated when I'm not believed about something. And it leaves you with at such a formative age, it leaves you with this feeling that you might have done something wrong or that you're in the wrong. If I send an email and I don't get an immediate reply, I go, oh, Jesus, Did I phrase that right? Have I offended them?
Yeah.
He eventually after I left, he got removed from the school. And, a lot of the stuff in the teacher is what happened to me.
Okay.
He got removed from the school because he injured a boy. I believe he went on to run a crammer in London, but he died in his 50s, presumably from some alcohol related. He beat boys till they bled, and looking back on it, you can see there was quite a turnaround of matrons. And obviously, because they were the ones dealing with it.
Yes.
And,
and no one said anything.
No. Well, I think some matrons did, and that's why they left. A lot of members of staff didn't say anything, and they should have done. We used to shower in, like sports people, you'd shower in communal showers. And whenever you looked around, the boys always had stripe marks on their ass. And if they were yellow, they'd been beaten in the last week. If they were red, they'd just been beaten. And it was just a way of life. It was
terrifying.
The cane was his weapon, and he used it. I think he had 5 or 6 Alsatians all named after operas. That should have been a clue.
Yes.
But, it was a sort of, and it changes your relationship with your parents. But I think, frankly, send your kids away at 9 or 7. Fine. You are changing a relationship with your children forever. I can't myself bear the idea of boarding schools. I had 2 girls. There was no way on earth and my wife feels the same way, that they would be sent away. Because why would you give up that time when the time is so short anyway? But, my parents had no excuse. We'd been in the RAF. We'd had this idyllic time in Singapore for 2 or 3 years. And I remember we flew back, which was quite traumatic. We had this dog. They're called station dogs. And basically they're kind of rescue dogs that get passed from one family to another RAF family. So they get looked after. And we had a dog, and obviously I had to say goodbye to this dog. Ride back to meet my grandparents and cousins who were strangers to me. Because,
I hadn't horrible.
Seen them. And then
not that they were horrible, I'm saying, but just
But you just don't know who they are. So we ride back on the Friday, 36 hours it takes to get back with 5 stops on a VC-10. And then I remember coming up to London, to Holborn on the Saturday, to an old department store that's no longer there called Gamages, where all this weird uniform. And on Monday, I'm dumped in this old stately home in the middle of Somerset, freezing cold. And my parents go. Thursday, Singapore, Monday, Somerset. Forget jet lag. Just the cultural. And I remember being in that dormitory in the first night, crying. And then,
how many boys were in your dormitory?
There was quite a small dormitory. The first dormitory was quite small, only about 10. But, it went on to 20, 30. But I remember crying and then realizing I wasn't the only one. You could hear other boys cry. I think with most people, it means your relationship with your parents is distanced. And it certainly was with mine.
It must feel like a huge rejection. And when did the beating start? How soon after?
2 weeks, a week.
Oh, my goodness.
The first assembly after, it's a Catholic school, so it's a very religious school. You had Sunday church, then you had an assembly in the hall. And I remember whispering to a boy who was very unhappy, "Are you all right?" And the headmaster saying, "Who was that? Who spoke?" I put my hand up. And afterwards, he took me and this other boy into his study and said, "This is what happens if you disobey the rules here," and started to beat the shit out of his sofa arm with his cane. And I remember this dust just going up there. And a week later, it was me. And I remember it really well because there was a boy, and his father was a famous pianist, but I won't mention who. And I was beaten. I couldn't believe the pain and the kind of, as a little sort of nod to the fact it was your first time, you only got 3 instead of 6. But I remember running into the school main building in tears. And this boy was sitting, who had just been beaten, was sitting on this enormous cast iron radiator. And he got off it and put me on it. Because that's what you did when you were beaten. You sat on the radiator to alleviate the pain. Right. And it was just such a sweet, kind gesture from a boy who was probably only 11 or 12. Then you learned you never cried. You never gave the bastard the satisfaction. You just stood up and stared at him. There was one boy who had this miraculous gift. I won't name him either. Wonderfully funny, mischievous boy. And he managed to always fart just before he was beaten. As he bent over, he would fart at the headmaster. I just thought that was brilliant.
Yeah, it's a brave move.
Yeah, because I'm sure he got beaten a bit harder. But then he came back one term with a tiny piece of foam rubber that he had purchased somewhere. And he used to rent it out for 10p and used to shove it down your trousers when you got beaten. Great entrepreneurship.
Yeah, he'll go far. Oh, that's just awful. And then when you ran away, you were just brought back and presumably punished for that. How far did you get?
The furthest I got was Chippenham and, ended up in farms and stuff. No, you never got punished for running away. That was weird. You never got beaten for that. Your parents were told. And I remember one boy ran away and I was summoned with 2 other boys by the headmaster as this boy arrived back. And the headmaster said to me, "You were the most unhappy boy last year. You were the most unhappy boy the year before. So I want you to talk to this boy." Like, to say what?
No.
So yeah, never beaten for running away. Maybe he admired it in some way. He also empowered the boys, the 13-year-old boys. There were things called drills, which were a punishment you were given less than a beating, where they would exercise you doing star jumps and whatever for half an hour. And these boys became sadists themselves. They would exercise you into the ground, including his son, who was like a mini me. And you think in schools across the country, middle class, upper middle class children were being beaten and disciplined in this way and told this is how life is. And they're now running the bloody country.
Yeah, get on with it. It's horrible. I hope you're also going to send your book to some of your contemporaries because I think it will be interesting for them to read.
A few I haven't heard from for decades have reached out. And I wrote a piece in the Telegraph about it and that people got in touch through that.
Were you able to move on? Was there ever a moment where you thought, actually, I have finally left this behind?
Yeah, quite early on. I mean, I'm not one of those people that it's haunted the rest of their lives. Writing The Teacher was an interesting experience because it brought out a lot of stuff. But no, it's not something, it's a story I tell. It's not something that's run my life. He didn't ruin my life. I just find it extraordinary that things like that happened.
Yes.
And hopefully they don't happen anymore, but give the wrong person authority. All sorts of things go wrong, And I mean, he was a dictator he had a martial law regime going on in that school that people were paying good money for.
Yeah. And children who are too vulnerable to fight back.
Absolutely.
Too small.
The only thing you could do was run.
Going back to your books, I don't know whether you've had offers yet, but it must be right on the cards for this to be turned into either a series or a series of films. Would you write the screenplay? Would you direct it?
I would definitely write the screenplays. I wouldn't direct it because I think a director has a really important role. So I think it would be important. If it was a TV series, I might direct some of the second series if we were lucky to have 2. But no, I think it's important for a third eye to come in and cast his or her magic on it. I think that's really important. The director's role is not to be underestimated in that way.
And is this now what you're doing full time?
I'm concentrating on this, but, the film world is weird. Someone may well come along, someone may not. It's also a very kind of age-structured industry. And, there's always someone, quite rightly, coming up behind you. I'm enjoying the freedom of this so much. I'm loving it. I'm very fortunate to have found it.
We're all very fortunate because we get to read it. So for this podcast, I read the first one and then I read the latest one. Mm-hmm. But I'm really looking forward to reading all the ones in between because I'm now reading something else and I'm quite missing Otti and Mackenzie and George. So I'm looking forward to getting back to them. So, but Tim, thank you so, so much for your time today. It's been just such a joy to talk to you. And it has been such a joy to read your book. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Bandwidth Conversations. Thanks to Anna B., Head of Marketing, to all of the podcast consultant, to Bagawire for the music, to the Money Maze podcast. Thank you for listening. Any feedback, please email me, katie@bandwidthconversations.com. Please sign up on our website, www.bandwidthconversations.com, so we can notify you about new podcast releases. We hope to see you again soon.